In my last video, I mentioned that the use of a jigsaw was a bit of an art form. So in this video, I'm going to go over everything I know about a jigsaw to see if I can help others improve their jigsaw skills and knowledge. I'll be using this jigsaw for demonstration. It's an older, corded DeWalt, but most jigsaws these days will have the same basic features. They're mostly used for cutting curves, and they do a great job of it. There are other tools you can use to cut curves, like the bandsaw or a scroll saw, but they have their limitations. A bandsaw can be expensive and is no help when cutting holes. The scroll saw is better at small, fine cuts. You wouldn't want to use it for longer cuts since the blade's so small. The jigsaw has its own limitations as well. It won't work for cutting really thick lumber, but in my workshop I almost never use any stock that's too thick for a jigsaw to cut through. Most of the newer saws will have a quick release mechanism that you can use to change the blade. Of course, unplug the saw or remove the battery if it's cordless. If you happen to bump the trigger while changing a blade, it's gonna hurt. And if you've been using the saw already, the blade can be really hot, so grab it with some pliers if you're not sure. If your saw has a quick change, then you need to use the T-shank blades. Older saws without the quick release will need to use a U-shank blade. These are not as stable as the T-shank type, and it takes longer to change the blade. So if you're about to buy a new jigsaw, then I suggest making sure you get one with the quick release system. To start the machine, you have the trigger here. Many of these are variable speed, so the more you squeeze the trigger, the faster the blade goes. There's also a dial on this trigger that you can use to set the speed of the saw. The saw's speed is important for what type of cut you're attempting. If you're cutting pine or other softwoods, you can let the saw run faster, but for hardwoods you may want to slow it down to avoid burning. Once you have your speed set, you can lock the trigger in if you're cutting a longer board and don't want to hold the trigger the whole time. For a more aggressive cut where you may not be concerned about splintering, you can use the orbital setting. This tilts the blade slightly forward and gives the blade an orbital action. Combine this with a low tooth per inch blade and you'll cut faster, but not cleaner. There are generally 3 different levels to this setting, number 3 being the most aggressive. This is the base plate or shoe of the saw. It can be tilted up to 45 degrees to make bevel cuts. I personally never use this function, but if you have any good examples of when this feature is useful, please leave a comment below. There's usually some kind of bolt or screw under the base plate. This is used to release it so you can then tilt it to either side. Many jigsaws will come with a cutting guide to help with those long straight cuts. This is also something I don't really use. If the cut needs to be straight, then I'm most likely going to use a circular saw. There are several different types of blades used for different jobs. Each blade has a tooth count or TPI, tooth per inch. The tooth per inch measurement relates to the quality of the cut. A blade with a low TPI like this one is intended for fast cutting without any tight turns, and it'll leave a lot of tear out or splintering on your lumber. A blade with a higher tooth count will leave a cleaner edge on the board, but it'll take longer to make the cut than a lower TPI blade would. A narrow blade like this one, also called a scroll saw blade, has a high tooth count and is great for making those tight curved cuts. You can also get blades that are designed for cutting metal, but I've never used them in my shop, though I do have a couple on hand if I ever need them. The direction the teeth are facing has a big impact on your cuts. Teeth that face up will keep the base plate tight to your workplace. The teeth do their cutting on the upstroke, so the resistance is pulling the saw down towards the wood. When cutting with a blade like this one, the tear out is more evident on the top of the workpiece, and the bottom will most likely be a lot smoother. A blade with teeth that face down will actually push the saw away from the material, so you have to use more pressure to keep the saw flat. And the splintering from this blade will be on the bottom of the workpiece rather than on the top. With any blade, turning the saw too fast will cause the blade to flex, and your cut will end up with an unintentional bevel. Some suggest that you start your cut when the saw is up to full speed, but I find that to be inaccurate. The blade wants to hop around a bit before really starting to cut. So I think it's best to place the blade on the line and then slowly squeeze the trigger. Let the blade score the wood a couple of times, and then back off a bit and get the saw up to speed. Now you can slowly move in and make your cut. One of the things that I use this saw for the most is cutting a hole in a board. For a circle, you can drill a small hole, big enough for the blade to fit into, and then cut your circle. Try to stay just inside your line, and if your cut's not perfect, then you can fix it with sanding. For a square hole, it's easier if you drill 2 holes and then cut until they meet. Another great use for the jigsaw is cutting handles. You just drill a couple of holes and then connect them. If you have any other tips or tricks for the jigsaw that you'd like to share, please leave them in the comments below. And if you're just getting started in woodworking, click here to see my beginner's guide video.